There are some stories that need to be told over and over and over again. Important stories, stories that define who we are, stories that tell us what we are about. For example, the creation story. The creation story in the book of Genesis, we hear it in chapter 1, and then we hear it again in chapter 2. There are just too many fabulous details for just one telling. And then there's the story of the Exodus, the great story, the great centerpiece of Judaism, the story of how God frees the Israelites from their bondage, from slavery, how Moses led them through the Red Sea. That story is told once in Exodus, but it's retold in the book of Psalms. The psalmists retell that story. And then you might remember at the Passover meal, at the Seder table, the story is told by grandmothers and grandfathers. Don't forget, they say. And what about the story of the life of Jesus? It's told at least 4 times in our Bible by different storytellers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and there are other versions out there. They tell the story of change, of conversion, and of resurrection. Maybe you in your own family or tradition have stories that are important to be told. And you tell them over and over and over again. Walter Brueggemann says that the deep places in our lives, places of resistance and embrace, are reached only by stories. The story of St. Paul. The story of St. Paul's is indeed a story of resistance and embrace. When we catch up with him today, he is telling his story for the 3rd time. Our Paul. I wonder if we, a church that is named after Paul, will hear any similarities as we hear his sacred story just one more time. You see, Saul was born in Tarsus. And one of my colleagues and professors, Matt Skinner, is kind of my go-to person for Paul. And Skinner writes that Paul was a Jew. He studied with a leading Jewish rabbi. Paul knew his stuff. Saul was also a Roman citizen. He was a part of a very progressive society and community and was deeply shaped by Greco-Roman culture. He grew up in an urban setting and was well versed in the languages of economics, citizenship, and athletics. He was educated and familiar with travel and commerce. But when we first encounter Paul in the Acts of the Apostles, it's in chapter 7. And Paul's name is Saul. And Saul is at the execution of a deacon named Stephen. You see, Saul was a very zealous Jew and was an ardent follower of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Saul was not a fan of those who followed Jesus because he felt that Jesus was pulling attention away from the God that Saul worshiped. So as part of his own religious zeal, Saul sought to take away the life and the freedom of those who participated in the Jesus movement. But one day Saul is traveling to Damascus, and that's a city about 135 miles north of Jerusalem. And on that road, Saul's story takes a turn. And you've heard it before, and I'm going to tell you again. This is the first telling of that conversion. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And the reply came, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. And so the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, because they heard the voice but saw no one. And Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And so they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. So that's the actual conversion story. But there's another little bitty tiny part. It turns out that Saul was not persecuting the early followers of Jesus, but notice that Jesus says, Saul, you're persecuting me. And then an interesting thing happens. God goes to a man named Ananias. And God asks Ananias to go to Saul and give him a charge. And Ananias says, and this is my own translation, no way. Have you heard of Paul? That dude is bad news. No, thank you, God. But God persists, and he says, go, for that man Saul is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. Paul is the instrument that's going to take Christianity out into the world and take it to that next level. And when we hear Paul's telling of the story again in today's reading from Acts, that is beginning to play out. Because Paul is getting the good news and the power of God out front. Remember, Paul is both a Jew and a citizen of Rome. He's a person of faith, and he knows the Roman lay of the land. So when we catch up with Paul in these later chapters of Acts, Skinner writes that Paul is already in the rarefied air of an elite and powerful culture. He is in front of a leader of Rome, one of the most powerful places on the planet. So our passage today is of an imprisoned Paul. He has been imprisoned, and he's telling the story for the third time about that encounter with Jesus. And if you want to get a sense of what that looked like, you can look right over there, because that is the window that depicts this very reading from Acts. Paul speaking to power. A window that we reclaimed a couple of years ago. All right, so that's enough of the history lesson. I just had to do it. I just figured that you should know a little bit about the complex figure after whom our complex church community is named. It is St. Paul's Sunday. Today is St. Paul's Sunday. And at the center of that is a conversion, a change of direction. And I asked our historians if they knew of any reason why our foremothers and forefathers chose Paul as our patron saint. No clue, really. There's nothing in the books. But maybe I have helped you make some connections. Maybe there's some similarities between St. Paul's and St. Paul. And here are just a few that I picked up on. First of all, Paul's story is long and complicated. And I could stop right there. Paul was once involved in a system in which he persecuted people and imprisoned them, took away their lives. He thought he was doing the right thing. Number 2, Paul had a moment of awakening. After that conversion, Paul's is a lived faithfulness. Paul is no longer promoting Paul. Paul is promoting life and resurrection. Insight number 3. Through Paul's gifts and resources, Paul is opening up new roads in new ways to new people. He is speaking truth to power, making way for society and culture to be a better place. And those truths got him into some pretty sticky situations. But God was with him throughout the entirety of his story. Maybe you heard some other similarities, some other connections. Or maybe you have issues with Paul, his writings, and his theology. That's for another sermon or Sunday school class or an entire semester at seminary. But I'd like to turn my attention instead to Paul, the human being, who seemed the most unlikely candidate for the job, but the person whom God chose to take God's sacred story out into the world. And somehow Paul's influence has made its way even to this place in the life and the history at 815 Grace Street. What strikes me most about today and about our Paul, and perhaps another similarity between him and us, is that throughout Paul's life, whether complicated or outrageous or infuriating, God was present. God didn't just pop up on that road in Damascus and change the course of Paul's life and say, later. No, through the experience of conversion and after the experience of conversion, God was there for the whole story. And that's what we must remember. God is there for the whole thing, what's in the past and what's in the future. God has showed up for the whole thing. Now, I know that some of us are going through hard times right now, and it's easy to think that God has left the building. You only need to remember that your life, like Paul's, is a sacred story. Your stories may be complicated. Paul can back you up on that. But sometimes our stories involve speaking truth to power, and sometimes our stories involve strange journeys, and sometimes our stories involve even lying helpless and vulnerable and blind on the road and having others support you and take care of you. God is there for it all. And so it is with us, St. Paul's. Our story is not over. What began some 175 years ago in the context of Richmond, Virginia, continues to be explored. And I feel like St. Paul's has had a Damascus Road experience, an ongoing conversion that has helped us see who we are and who we are called to be. Did Paul always get it right? Do we? Does Paul always say the right things? Do we? No, but God still remains faithful for those who remain faithful to the story. And I can't help but think of a woman named Ramona. Ramona was at one of my previous parishes, and in that congregation, we celebrated birthdays with those persons in prison. So in June, we gathered all the people whose birthdays were in June, and we'd go and we'd take cake and we'd take ice cream. And Ramona would go with us faithfully. She was in her 80s. We'd walk through locked doors and we'd get frisked by guards and share cake and ice cream with 30 or so imprisoned men. And what would Ramona do? She would dance. She'd been a dance teacher her whole life. And she would dance with these people from all kinds of backgrounds. And the thing about Ramona is that she was blind. She could not see those with whom she was dancing. But she was determined to participate and offer her gifts. And I like to think that on those nights, on those birthdays, their feast day, those men felt free, thanks to the gyrating hips and the gentle smile of a person like Ramona. I was with Ramona in the last moments of her life, and at her hospital bed, she said, "I sang my song." "What do you mean?" I asked. She said, "I did what God called me to do. I sang my song and I told my story." Each of you is a sacred story. Each of you. What is your sacred story? What is your song to sing? What story gets into those deep places of life? What song do you want to take with you? What story do you want to add to the tapestry like a quilt that keeps you warm at night and sings you to sleep? Today we celebrate our own ongoing conversion. Conversion into a life of hope and resurrection. Our ongoing call to do different and be different, to make the world more filled with song and with dance and with stories of love and justice and peace through your story and through my story. Through your song and through my song, the grand conversion continues. Happy Conversion Day, St. Paul's. May there be many more.